talk about feminist foreign policy, the what, the how, and what is it. And I'm thrilled to have my sisters in arms here from the collaborative to talk about it. And I will introduce them. I'm going to try to not look at my notes, but this is what happens when you become more advanced in age. When we get wiser, absolutely, absolutely. Kavita Ramdas is the activist in residence at the Global Fund for Women. And you also mentioned that you also have another role.
I'm principal of my consulting practice, KNR Sisters.
Wonderful. Bridget Burns is, she is the executive director of the Women's Environmental and Development Organization, which we were just talking about because it was founded by a woman that I really admire, Bella Abzug. Yes, absolutely. And Adriana Mond is a program officer with the Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security.
Women of Color Advancing Peace, Security, and Conflict Transformation.
Oh, okay.
Yes, it's a very long title, and we abbreviated to WCAPS. The conflict transformation was added later.
Okay, because that I was not aware of, so thank you very much for that. And Caitlin Horrigan, who is the Senior Director of Global Advocacy for Planned Parenthood. And as I mentioned, we are here on behalf of the coalition. I'm going to try to read this. I don't have my old lady glasses on, so let's see how well this goes. Just very briefly, we want to talk about the importance of feminist foreign policy, but particularly here in the United States. And we're part of the coalition, which you'll hear from the founder and head of the organization, Lyric Thompson, tomorrow morning. She'll talk a little bit more about that. It's an organization of more than 80 organizations advocating for our vision of a U.S. feminist foreign policy and holding policymakers to account. And so we all kind of come from different backgrounds. And we want to talk to you why we've all come together and why we believe it's very important for the United States to have a feminist foreign policy. I think briefly this morning it was mentioned. Feminist foreign policy was pioneered by Sweden in 2014. And I think at the time when Sweden unveiled and rolled out this concept of feminist foreign policy, everyone said, oh, that's very nice, it's very Swedish. You know, looking at foreign policy through what one of the speakers talked about, resources, rights, and representation. But since then, there have been 16 other governments that have adopted it. And we can get into that a little bit more, but since we're here to talk about feminist foreign policy, I just want to kick it off by asking, why is feminist foreign policy important? I'm going to throw it out there. So, Kavita, do you want to kick it off?
Yeah, salam namaste, everyone, and thank you. I'm sorry that you're not getting first choice, which was Latanya, but she's on the Hill, so I'm really glad to be here, and I'm honored to be here in my role as an activist in residence. I think the why feminist foreign policy has to begin first with why feminism needs to be in everything we do and in all policies that we have. And I think there is a real danger in separating out what we do out there, which is what foreign policy usually refers to, right? Something that is being done for the rest of the world, for those people out there, outside of our national boundaries, versus an intent and a commitment to actually build all of your work around the radical concept that all human beings matter, which is really what it means to be a feminist. And I think that what's important and that is often not spoken about is that Sweden, at the time that they did adopt the feminist foreign policy, did so with a very clear articulation of the fact that they had grounded that work in a set of domestic policies that were rooted in a feminist intersectional understanding of their own commitments and their values and principles. So what I would say is that for much of the Western world in particular, as somebody who grew up in a part of the world that is now euphemistically referred to as either the developing world or the global South, I will say that the notion of being objects or recipients of foreign policy of privileged, usually white, usually much wealthier Western nations, doesn't become any sweeter if you sort of add women and stir, which is what I think many of us are afraid that foreign policy will devolve into. So much easier to worry about those poor women in Afghanistan or those poor women in Rwanda or those poor women wherever in the world, and not take a look in your own backyard where maternal mortality rates are higher than many other quote-unquote developing countries in the world, where a black woman or a black child runs the risk of actually dying in childbirth at a rate that many developing countries have long since made obsolete. So for me, I think the reason to be having this conversation and pushing the United States and any other government is to say, you need this both at home, in everything that you do and how you engage with the issues that matter at home, and then you need to translate that into a set of policies and a set of actions that are actually valuing all other human beings, no matter where they are in other parts of the world. That's what it means to me. But Bridget, I'll let you talk from a planet perspective, since I've gone on about people.
Well, I think feminist foreign policy, I see it as a project, and a worthwhile project for all of us to be part of, because at its core, a foreign policy that is feminist could and should be a lens for fundamentally shifting and radically reimagining our approach to policy in general that centers solidarity. And obviously, one of the main drivers for our thinking as an organization around this is because there's no more clarifying crisis than the climate crisis to why a different and radical approach to policy that is focused on collaboration and solidarity is not just a wish and a hope, it's necessary for being able to sustain life on Earth. And one thing my colleague Fleur, who's here from the UN Climate Change Convention, said that feels really important as we discuss the climate crisis is understanding that although it's a crisis that has environmental impacts, it's not an environmental crisis, it's a socio-economic crisis that requires a real shift in the way we approach policies. And so I think what I've seen already that the project of feminist foreign policy has done is it allows having that conversation with governments who declare themselves as feminists to hold them accountable to a more systemic vision of what their overall foreign and development policies should look like that move beyond adding women and stirring, which it feels like we have all been trying to move beyond for decades now. But I think that regardless of whether that is happening, I think we're all very concerned that under the guise of feminist foreign policy, the same trends will continue. Right. It allows us to be in conversation around accountability to what a true systemic feminist approach looks like. I think it's also been hugely beneficial as a convening space for feminists and movements who are working across multiple issues, whether it is climate, environment, gender-based violence, et cetera, to define for ourselves what that vision of foreign policy is. And I think we're in a moment, as I said in the start, of radical reimagining, and this feels like the promise of this project.
Yeah, Adriana.
Yes, to continue down the line. I mean, I feel like you both have said it all, and so I don't necessarily know what to add to it. There is a definite need for the U.S. to stop looking at itself as this isolated country and to realize that we are in a global space.
Yep.
And to your point that any policy that we make, whether it's domestic or foreign, the implications are going to hit us.
Yep.
And they're going to impact our people, they're going to impact our resources, they're going to impact how we engage on a national and an international stage, which in recent years has been a little wishy-washy, but overall, shifting to a feminist foreign policy lens, to your point, Bridget, is one that holds us accountable. And it holds us accountable to intersectionality, it holds us accountable to the marginalized groups that we have consistently left out of rooms. It holds us accountable to groups that we have consistently left out of conversations and out of bills, to the points that were made this morning about migrant farmers who come up to the U.S. who are not
Right.
part of bills for employment and resources and protections. And so a feminist foreign policy, it has at its root, to the point that the 3 R's, right? The resources and the other 2 that of course escape me as I sit here in the middle. But it has at its root a care for people that has been absent in the way that we have done policy in almost every country across the globe. And I was watching another panel on feminist foreign policy as I was preparing for this one. And one of the panelists was a minister from Slovenia. And he said, it's very interesting that the world is currently being led by men who want to live in the past. And that holding to the past it's what we saw in June with the SCOTUS decisions. It's a lot of what we see in terms of how people react when they hear the term feminist foreign policy, which is at its core, it's supposed to be an inclusive term. It's supposed to be a term that calls people in and has us have conversations that are a little bit tougher than the typical, well, let's just go to war approach that we tend to take. But yeah, so that's why it's important to me, because it calls people in, it has you have those conversations, but it has you do so in a safe space where you're allowed to make missteps, and you're allowed to say, you know what, I did this wrong in the 50s, but it's 2023, we're going to change it for the better.
So Caitlin, let me ask you, you represent Planned Parenthood, and I think when people obviously say anything about gender or feminism, they automatically think about reproductive rights. But when we talk about foreign policy, that does not factor in, and especially if we use the word national security. And so when we talk about feminist foreign policy, we are also talking about national security. How does reproductive rights and the work that you do, why is that important to include in this conversation?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think it's clear when you look at sexual and reproductive health and rights, they are so essential to the achievement of many foreign policy goals that countries, including the US, say they are working towards. So things like advancing global health, supporting human rights, delivering gender equality, supporting economic growth, all of those things are intimately tied in the achievement of sexual and reproductive health and rights for all. And yet, that's an area that's been so chronically under-resourced and siloed because it's viewed as soft in the realm of foreign policy, or siloed because it's viewed as too controversial, and we'd rather stay in the safe women's territory, which brings us all together. And it's really been to the detriment of our collective interests and work. So I think we're interested in feminist foreign policy because it does really offer an alternative vision to our opposition, who I spend a lot of time working with the US Congress. I know many of you spent time up there today. When you look at some of the bills that are coming out of the House of Representatives, it's very clear to see that their vision is comprehensive and it's global. One bill is attacking not only abortion rights, but also LGBT rights, DEI efforts, multilateralism. You pick it, they're attacking it, and I think we have to meet the moment with an equally, and I would think more robust vision, collective vision for foreign policy that really holds us together and offers that alternative to the world that you said they're trying to drag us backwards towards.
Yes.
I just want to add that I think there's a piece on the question of reproductive. There's a piece with regard to the whole question of reproduction that is also really important. We heard Senator Tim Kaine this morning talk about the fact that we take for granted democracy in this country. Many other countries, like the one I'm from, India, have similarly taken democracy for granted, and then all of a sudden you find you have a rise of authoritarianism. I think something that's important to put on the table is that there is a very clear and unambiguous connection with women's bodies as the site of the conversation around authoritarianism. There's a reason why power over our bodies is related to our lack of power in the body politic. The more you can control our bodies, the less we actually have power in the political spaces. And it's interesting to me that the same people who are saying that women should not be able to control the number of births that they have or the choices that they make about their sexuality are the same people saying, yes, you should have more children for the fatherland or for the nation or whatever. And this is true across the board, you know. So when women's bodies are treated as vessels for reproduction at will, in the service of some greater mythology around nation, I think that's something we also have to be aware of. So it's not only that they are denying us the choices to make about our own sexuality and our own sexual reproduction behavior and rights, but it's also that there is actually an ulterior motive around how demography is being used both to scare people. So whether it is, I always found it hilarious in the United States that they speak of a time when this country will become majority minority. And I'm like, wait, even when we become the majority, we're still called the minority? What is that about? Like, what? And I think that should clue us in. There is something there that's really critical about our ability to bring life on the planet that is frightening to the same forces that would like to have it go one way or another. And the idea that migrant women and brown and black bodies would somehow make up the majority of a nation that has at its root white supremacy in its founding principles is frankly terrifying. And I think that's another reason for us to be talking about foreign policy in a way that is grounding our work inside a lot of issues that we are also fighting for at the domestic levels.
Yeah, I'm going to pick up on that because, Bridget, you work on climate change, and you just talked a little bit about the importance of feminist foreign policy. And I think one of the things, you know, at least in the conversation when you in U.S. foreign policy circles, it is, you know, how do we get climate change to be a national security priority? And one thing that is overlooked is that the people that climate change is most impacting are women, particularly brown women in the global South.
Yeah, I mean, I think building on what Kavita was sharing is starting out with the idea that feminists, for anything that when from a systemic feminist perspective is grounding in the reality of the isms of white supremacy, of, you know, colonialism, capitalism, and patriarchy, and the ways in which that is reproduced in the heart of all of our different crises that we're facing, including the climate crises, including what is at the heart of driving an extractive-based economy. So for us, you know, having analysis of the climate crisis from a feminist perspective is critically important to understanding what the solutions are, because you know, the project that we're undertaking is not, yes, we are trying to convince people that the climate crisis is real, but that's the hurdle. That's not actually the big major struggle. The struggle is what is the solution to that crisis, and this is where there is a lot of malpractice happening, and this is where a lot of inequity is being embedded from the start, and so there's ways in which we look at this, and I think the lens of feminist foreign policy is important here because there's no such thing as domestic climate policy. The lack of or the type of action that we take in our country or any country, particularly in a country like the US, which is a historical emitter, which is one of the largest producers of carbon emissions, our approach to domestic policy and the way in which we embed human rights and equity in that approach is directly related to what our approach to foreign policy is. Yep. And you know, I shared an article this morning that my colleague Mara had shared with us earlier, with our team earlier, written by Rihanna Gunright, who is just an incredible leader in the national movement for climate justice, really drawing attention to the ways in which the largest climate investment program that we have in the United States in the Inflation Reduction Act has potentially embedded a lot of ways to leave Black people fully out of a green transition, and has worked to further marginalize climate justice communities who were at the start of flagging and putting as a top priority for this administration climate action. I really invite you all to read that article because I think there's a lot in there that speaks to the ways in which we could easily approach climate action from a foreign policy lens in a siloed way that serves to only further entrench inequalities if it's not taken from a justice perspective. We have a coalition called the Feminist Green New Deal. My colleagues, Diana from Madre and others in this room are part of that. One thing that we looked at, for example, this is something Rihanna also worked on, was how climate policies and care policies need to intersect. And again, this is thinking about this at a domestic level, but it speaks fully to the way in which we anticipate and see if the US were to adopt a feminist foreign policy. But what would that mean in terms of changing its posture towards climate action globally? And it looks like a lot of things, but it's fully changing the way in which it enters into global climate change negotiations from genuinely the space of competition and seeing it as a trade agreement as opposed to a space for needed global solidarity and collaboration. I think we run the risk when we talk about the intersections of gender and climate change of, yes, recognizing that women are at the front lines of climate crisis and at the front lines of movements, and they need investment and they need resources, but what that doesn't mean is that US feminist foreign policy on climate is just adding women to the currently existing climate actions that the US is doing. It means a complete change in posture in the way that the US approaches trade agreements. It's understanding that the way in which we set up our systems to who has access and ownership over community resources, how you can deliver and develop community energy systems, how you can invest in regenerative agriculture systems. The US policies around trade have a huge impact on those access issues. And that's a climate justice and a gender justice issue, because this is at the front lines of where women are, where they're being marginalized, where they need to have access to these resources. It is a US understanding that women and girls and people of gender diverse communities are facing the impacts of climate injustice right now. They're facing loss and damage. And so it changes the posture that the US brings into the climate negotiations, which is one that recognizes their historical responsibility, which is about investing in the resources, mobilizing climate finance. You know, these are the conversations that when we do talk about foreign policy with the US and with other governments that have declared it, they're not yet there. They're often still at the stage of kind of integrating gender into their climate policies as opposed to thinking about how it relates across all their other pieces. And that doesn't even cover things like the approach to debt, for example, which puts particularly climate vulnerable countries who are already facing crippling debt from systems that are upheld by US foreign policy and the ways that they approach these issues. It means that they don't have the resources they need to respond to increasing disasters, let alone the resources needed to invest in systems of care, which ultimately I think is the project of this work, to be able to have the resources to invest in care. And so, you know, it's this sense that it's a reimagining of what it means to engage in foreign policy towards global solidarity. And yes, there is this conversation around how it also supports national security. But, you know, we would argue that it has to move also beyond what we've seen, which are just approaches to greening the military, for example, that we actually need to reckon with the impact of the military and the defense as a sector in increasing the climate crisis and increasing insecurity for women around the world.
So I'm going to pick up on, you talked a little bit about the people who are at the table and the negotiators. And once upon a time, many years ago, I used to actually work at the State Department, which I think the State Department has come a long way, but at the time that I was there, it was pale, male, and Yale. And a lot of the reason that I actually did leave Washington and the State Department was because someone who looked like me with a name like mine was never going to have a future at the State Department. And so, Adriana, you are very focused in on working on advancing peace and security. You're very much focused on that world. How has the absence of inclusion impacted foreign policy? And I think relevant to this conversation, we're talking about bringing in a number of different perspectives into a conversation about feminist foreign policy. We're talking about reproductive rights, we're talking about climate change, obviously global health plays a huge role in it. How do we make sure that all of these different voices are included?
Well, I think a part of it is security. We talk about a lot and very often because it's very important, the insecurity that women face in economics, in our homes, in gender-based violence. In almost every level of the board, women face a certain type of insecurity. For Black and brown women, it is higher. But there's also the insecurity on the other side. If I give an inch, will I lose my status? To your point about it being a competition and trade agreements and can I do more and can I be better than the person beside me? That, because it's a zero-sum game, it is very hard to have these conversations and to get people to move from their positions because they fear that they're going to become the marginalized group. I do not accept the term minority because there is nothing minor about me. And Dr. Nola Haynes said that and I was like, she is right. But because we have yet to address that insecurity, it makes it so much harder to have an intersectional conversation because you'll bring a Black person to the table and the Black person will be at a table with an Indigenous person. And instead of us coming together and having a conversation, it'll be, oh, okay, oppression Olympics. And that makes it difficult to have conversations, but I think we're also in a space where we're recognizing that we have to move past that and have care for each other while also holding on to what our experiences are. And so I think when you go into spaces and you have a table that has the Black person, the Indigenous person, the white, pale, male Yale guy from Yale, you're able to have conversations where I can acknowledge that as a white man, I don't understand the struggles of a Black woman. As a Black woman, I can acknowledge that I have no tribal lands that are consistently being taken away from me for oil fracking. I do not have that struggle. But what struggle I do have is against the systems that continue to put money above my care. And so when we get to that root level of the insecurity for us, for Black people, for brown people, for women, then we can start having these conversations because we're beyond, oh, this is my personal experience, and we're hitting on, well, this is the actual root cause of it. And so a lot of conflict transformation work is doing that. It's peeling back the layers of the onion so that we can have those discussions, whether it's domestically or internationally, about what is causing us to struggle, what is causing us to not have spaces where we can have conversations, where we have access to resources, where we can come into rooms and say, hey, as an Indigenous leader, I have this knowledge that I would like to share with you because my tribe has lived here for thousands of years and we didn't have these problems. And I think that when we can get to a space where we have those conversations authentically and when we're okay and comfortable with the pain and that's going to cause us, and we have those mental health spaces where we can have these trauma-informed conversations, then we're going to be able to move forward. And it's really important for feminist foreign policy to come into play because that's not going to happen in a room full of males. They do not have the security within themselves to take that step back and say, this is not a zero-sum game. If we all get together, we can all win, and then we can move forward. It's the same reason that, to Kavita's point, that women's bodies are now seen as tools for the nation. It's the same reason that climate change and climate action is still being denied by a large percentage of the population, be it in the US or abroad. Because if we deny these things, if we take ownership over things that do not belong to us, then we continue to have power. And people are very scared to release power, which is unfortunate because, quite frankly, we don't own anything on this planet. It was all here before we were here, and it's going to be here a very long time after us.
Well, we hope so.
We hope so. Yeah. That's the hope. There's no planet B. But I think that a large part of it is acknowledging that the root cause is systems that are in place and not the person. So when I'm having a conversation with you, random stranger, and I'm saying, well, you know, as a Black woman, I've experienced this, you know, or if I'm from Flint, Michigan, or from Louisiana, or from any other city or state where water isn't potable in the U.S., and we say like in the U.S. like it's, oh my God, I can't believe that's a thing, but it is. And we're only now becoming more aware of it because of social media and people speaking about their experiences in such a way that we can have the conversations about the ways in which that our country needs to improve so that we can say that we are caring for our citizens, that we are, you know, upholding feminist foreign policy, feminist domestic policy. And we have to find out how to shift from just having these conversations into actionable items. And a lot of that is going to be more conversations. But the second part of that is joining things like the Feminist Foreign Policy Collaborative so that we can put in place accountability measures so that we can have conversations across the field, like on this panel, for example, all of us is from different spaces, and so that we can then say, well, this is a next step, and it's concrete. So we cannot green the military, because that is the stupidest sentence I've ever heard. But what we can do is we can see what new technologies exist to replace asphalt roads. And Build Back Better, a lot of it was about infrastructure. None of it was about how to make infrastructure more green or long lasting. It was about how to continue to do the systems that were already in place so that Philly continues to have potholes every winter.
I want to pick up on the point, Kavita, that you also picked up about not having autonomy over our bodies. And I think the interesting thing is when you take a look at U.S. policies, 20, even 30 years ago, it was actually about, supporting women. You hear about how George W. Bush talked about we went into Afghanistan to liberate the women, and kind of supporting women's movements. And I also love how the American government also wants to always save Muslim women. I'm a Muslim woman. I don't particularly think I personally need to be saved, but. But now we're seeing, with the Dobbs decision, we're seeing a step back in that. Kind of how does that, and I look at Latin America. I mean, Mexico just passed a court decision where they have approved choice, and you've seen it in Argentina and Colombia. And these really very Catholic conservative countries, now the Green movement has swept through Latin America. How are they moving forward, and why are we moving back?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's a lot of hope and excitement to see what's happened, not only in Latin America, but certainly incredible gains there, but in places like Benin, all over the world. The US is really an outlier in the trend of going backwards when it comes to something like reproductive rights, which is why I think it's so interesting to think about a foreign policy which could break down those traditional barriers of power, to go from helping to solidarity, but also to create a culture of learning. Because I think about what we are seeing in the US and for abortion providers across the country, what an urgent moment to learn from innovative work that is happening in other places, and places that are winning and expanding rights. And it's, I think, both on the service delivery side, like how do providers and community activists work in very restrictive settings and still get the people the care and information that they need and deserve, but also how do you organize and activate in tough challenges? We are not unique in the challenges that we face when it comes to religion or culture. Many countries have dealt with that. Feminists have overcome and grappled. And I would just love to see more of that cross-border learning. And I think a feminist foreign policy, an opportunity to do that at a mega level. Hopefully we as community can create that now. We don't have to wait for government to do that for us. But I do think there would be power in shifting our government more towards that orientation so that we could have that learning. And a reoccurring theme that I've heard from all of us is just the shift towards solidarity. And we as the U.S. shouldn't just be quietly applauding, the fight and achievement of rights in other spaces. We should be actively funding and supporting the groups who are on the front lines of making that happen for their own people. And there are many barriers, cultural and hard policy barriers, that prevent us from doing that, whether a policy like the Global Gag Rule, the Helms Amendment, the Soul Gender Amendment. We could name all the horrible amendments that have existed for years and decades, and all of those need to go to really put us in a space where we could not only be, cheering them on, but actively supporting the communities that are doing that work for themselves.
I think the point about the savior complex, I think we're all done with being saved. Thank you very much. Please, put your own oxygen mask on before rescuing others, I would say. This is a nation gasping from toxic fumes of racism, of white supremacy, of patriarchy. They're going to come and help the rest of the world. Thank you. Please save us really this kind of civilizing discourse, which was the whitewash for colonialism and colonial extraction, is not something that the rest of the world is willing to put up with anymore. Honestly, I think that facade has been stripped away. And I think if the United States really, to me, what a feminist foreign policy would be to own up to your own responsibilities. Why has the United States refused to sign the agreements, not for CEDAW, which is the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, not for the Convention on the Rights of the Child, not to join the International Criminal Court, because otherwise Donald Rumsfeld and Henry Kissinger and George W. Bush should all be lined up in front as criminals. Why is it only, how interesting that the International Criminal Court only catches people from poor African countries? Right. What is up with that? Like, you know, and I think on the question of feminist foreign policy, I think understanding how hypocrisy and double standards has led to a world in which I agree about this greening the military, having grown up in a military family in India. I can tell you very clearly, India wanted to be a nuclear power because it was tired of being pushed around. And that's the deal, okay? Why is it 5 countries are allowed to have nuclear weapons? Based on what? You used it very responsibly? Hello, hello Hiroshima, hello Nagasaki. You know, does anybody remember that? And I just think that for us within the United States to push for a more humble and for a more solidarity-based understanding of what a feminist foreign policy has to look like in 2023 will require a fundamental shift in understanding that you don't go from, you know, this notion of massive competition. I think that was, many of us use that term, because the only way you can be number one is if you think in linear terms. You know, 1 is at the front of the line, 25 is at the back of the line. But if you stand in a circle, there's no beginning or end. And last time I checked, the Earth was a globe and was not. So I think we are going to also have to fundamentally undo certain assumptions about nationalism that are based on this fundamental notion of competition, on which also the extractive capitalist economy is also based on that, right? You have to be better than everybody else. You have to do more. You have to consume more of everything else. An average American consumes 40 times what a Bangladeshi consumes. If you're going to have that level of consumption, the whole world cannot, you know, as Gandhi said, there's plenty in this world for everybody's need, but not for everyone's greed.
Well, I mean, no, I mean, I talk a lot about, in my class, I actually teach a class called Feminist Foreign Policy. And so I'm gonna open it up to questions, but one of the points is, you know, we have this conversation about democracy, and going out and preserving democracy, and yet what I see the United States having done is it's prioritized capitalism and free markets.
Correct. And
really kind of made democracy, you know, kind of an afterthought. And it's just like, 100%. Well, if you're going to actually make everything about consumerism and the pursuit of profit, well then yeah, democracy will die.
Correct.
My class, I teach at Bard College. If you know anything about Bard College, it's a very woke, lefty place. The class is very popular. But my students are very skeptical that the United States can actually embrace a feminist foreign policy. So as I wrap up and then open up to the floor, my question to all of you is, can the United States adopt a feminist foreign policy, and if so, how does it do it? Go ahead.
I think it will be difficult. One of the things that I frequently talk about with friends and colleagues is the fact that a good percentage of our governing body is over the age of 60. And I know I said it earlier where, you know, old men lead and they're trying to lead us back to the past, but there have been social shifts in norms that have not been reflected in politics. And there have been social shifts in norms that have been reflected in politics, because I'm not just going to act like it's only old people who can be racist, bigoted, and all of the other terrible isms that exist. But they typically have the loudest voice. And so it's difficult when you have this box and the only voices you're hearing are the ones that sound a lot like 45, which is how I refer to the president before Biden. But it's going to be difficult, but it's not impossible. When you have civil society organizations, you have coalitions such as this, when you have more access to getting together, The pandemic has done a lot of things, and one of the things it did was show us that we can show up for each other virtually. I don't need to be located in Alabama to help my sister out from this morning. I can be in Philadelphia, learn about what's happening there, send resources, send support. And when we have those conversations, and we're starting to have more of them, then we can affect change. And we don't talk about social media enough as an agent for change. Typically, it's about the disinformation and misinformation that exists on that platform. But there's also a lot of information sharing that is positive. There's also a lot of community building, a lot of spaces where people are talking about things that are happening in their neck of the woods, their city, their state, their country, that we would not have been aware of. And so I think the other thing that's happening is that as a generally the populace is recognizing that we are more alike than we are different. Mm-hmm. And because we're having that recognition, we're also looking for leaders who have that recognition. And so while the change might be slow and it might be hard fought, as we saw with the SCOTUS decisions, even as our Congress and our presidential office was trying to move forward, SCOTUS was like, no, come on back. So while it might be difficult, it's not impossible, it's just gonna take time, and the change is going to have to come from the ground up. As always, civil society organizations standing in solidarity with one another, having those conversations and creating those spaces so that we can build the leaders that we want to see and give access to people who maybe, to your point of being the first of your name in the State Department. We need to make room for more of the first of their names in the State Department, the first of their backgrounds in the State Department. Otherwise, it's going to continue to be predominantly male, pale, and Yale.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I would just say that I think it's really important that we not get overwhelmed or stuck on the idea of, is the U.S. in the next year or so going to have a document that outlines a feminist foreign policy and a resolution to do so? I think that there's possibilities, and there's obviously things that we're all collaborating on to make that happen, but that, because I can understand in this room how unrealistic that feels, especially one that would meet the grandiose idea that we have here. However, and this is again why I see feminist foreign policy as a project, because if we accept the reality of where we are in the multiple crises that we face, we cannot avoid the project of working to shift our foreign policy and shift our policies in general towards solidarity, towards divestment from harm to investment in care, and really believing in the project of feminism, of systemic feminism that is intersectional, that puts the views, the values, the needs, the leadership of Black, Brown, Indigenous communities at the front lines of policymaking, that treats the process of policymaking different, collaborative, with a deep, deep commitment to consultation and consent, and that sees the way in which we approach all forms of policymaking from this deeply systemic view. That has to be all of our project. We have to not get overwhelmed by the idea of the reality of the document or the output, feeling like we shouldn't take the path of the project, right? Because I think that there is a lot of hope and there's a lot of potential in collaborating with each other. And one thing I was going to say about Kavita's point is what has been inspiring to us to maintain our commitment to this project is the fact that it's not just a Swedish invention anymore. It is global majority countries coming to the table, challenging from a decolonial practice. It's Colombia saying our feminist foreign policy is pacifist, and challenging countries to say, oh, this is actually something we need to think about in what we're doing. And so I would just invite everyone here to be thinking about what it means to be part of this collective project together of being determined that we have to reimagine our approach to policy in general, but particularly global solidarity and foreign policy.
Yeah.
Caitlin?
Sure. I think just picking up on what Bridget described, one of the things I've appreciated about this coalition and community is that we do talk about a journey towards, and I think that gives you an incremental roadmap towards seeing that there will be wins along the way in words and in deeds from the US government, but it's also not like there's one day that we'll achieve the win and then we'll all be able to pull back, even if we get to the moment where we feel like we've done it, the US has a feminist foreign policy, there'll be so much accountability work and so many missteps likely after that moment where, you know, we'll have to call people in and push, and there'll be tension in priorities. So, you know, it is an iterative, constant life's work, I think, to push for this and demand and hold people accountable. But I do think it's possible. And when, you know, I reflect about global landmark moments in the field of sexual and reproductive health and rights, I can't help reflect on the 30th anniversary that's coming next year on the International Conference on Population and Development. And that was a groundbreaking, earth-shattering shift driven by women in the global south to demand that development policy put their rights and needs and decision-making at the center. And have we achieved that? No, but it did transform, I think, a lot of how the work showed up. And so to me, it's an inspiring example of that big change is possible and that we can push off from that point and achieve big things together. So that gives me the optimism that, you know, it is possible here.
Kavita.
I agree. I mean, I think that many people have already spoken about the power of transnational feminist movements, and sitting with my hat as activist in residence at the Global Fund for Women, I'm very inspired by the idea that we let movements lead and we take our lead from movements that are on the ground. And I think that many of those movements are not waiting for national governments to give them permission to build alliances across boundaries, across nations, across traditional divides of, you know, religious or faith or, you know, nation citizenship. So I think that those movements are going to basically shake the foundations of many national governments and force a reckoning. And that those reckonings combined with what is happening in the natural world is going to challenge people in a really fundamental way to step outside of the traditional ways. I think even foreign policy is somewhat limited, right? Because it still takes the nation state as its primary, you know, as the primary framework for how you would define policy. But I think really what the people of the earth are saying is, guys, we have no time. We have no time to be working in your narrow national boundaries to be able to kind of deal with a crisis that is actually like a fundamental existential crisis for the planet as a whole. And I guess that's what gives me hope. I sort of feel like there is a whole young generation of people who are just like, oh, forget about this BS, you know, we're not going to, and that is where I think your point on social media, you know, 100%, right? Because there is a new generation that has grown up figuring out that there are ways in which to do solidarity in a way that I think we haven't had really since the heyday of the communist movement globally, in which we said, you know, workers of the world unite. And we haven't had that moment. And I know in America, if you say anything about communists, people are like, we probably will get rounded up by somebody outside. But that really was one of the last times that we've had that level of global solidarity. And even the term solidarity comes from those experiences. So thank you for raising that up.
And I just also wanted to point out, obviously I don't know what it was like at that time, but the world is also so much more restrictive in terms of who can move where. And so if you wanted to have, for instance, an in-person conference, you have to move past visas
100%.
and plane tickets and hotel fees and all of these things that are essentially red tape. And if we're trying to do this work in solidarity, it just makes more sense for us to shift to that virtual model, for us to move out
100%.
of traditional methods for conducting solidarity work.
And it's better for the planet.
It is also better for the planet.
Great. I'm happy to take a few questions from the audience.
There's one here.
Yes, here.
Hello? Okay. Hi there. Diana Alonso-Watkins, and I'm here on behalf of Diversity Fund and RAG, the Association of Grant Makers. Had a question specifically in regards to philanthropy and funders and where there's an absence of Black, Indigenous, women of color in governance, sure. Specifically in decision-making in boards. I think about climate justice and where it is certainly a global issue, but in many ways, philanthropy on the grant-making side has already stepped back from supporting communities of color, women of color, and climate justice work specifically in favor of sort of other sort of processes. But what about sort of the objective of working towards having global majority representation on boards and amplifying the work of women of color in government?
Such a good question. I mean, one could ask, how is that connected to feminist foreign policy? And I would say in every way, because I actually think that the ways in which these efforts will be supported and funded has everything to do with how successful they will be, right? So we shouldn't be feeling like we have to be going around with a begging bowl for something that is actually self-evident and is valuable, and yet, in part because of your very correct analysis, that we are still a very long way away from people of the global majority. You're right. Why do we even accept the term minority? I'm like, but this. I think it is, not only that is going to be interesting, but what is also interesting is that the accumulation of wealth has created a whole philanthropic class outside of the global north. So, I'm really curious, is like what happens when you have a progressive Indian philanthropist who decides to fund Black Lives Matter in the United States? Oh, then what happens, or a Chinese philanthropist who wants to be able to support Standing Rock. Oh, then what happens, right? So there's been a kind of assumption, which is a post-colonial assumption, that all the money flows are like them being so nice to us, poor people in the global south. But it's like the global south, like we're not one, homogenous entity, and we've got plenty of money. And what if we started coming to, even the whole framing of the UN, the framing of these 5 powers, it's the same. The governance question that you're raising with regard to philanthropy exists at every level of governance. Even to this day, only someone from the United States can be head of the World Bank. Why? Because they decided, like at the end of the world, when they, at the end of the Second World War, when they divvied up the world and they said, we people will get to choose this, Europeans will have the International Monetary Fund, and Americans will have the World Bank. And then we'll help those poor countries over there. Same with why those 5 countries are the head of the United Nations at the Security Council. Why? Because they have nuclear weapons. So now do a few of us also have nuclear weapons. But I think we must ask that question. We must push for the challenging. We must ask, and we must also say that I think the question of, the golden rule cannot just be anymore the man who has the gold.
Yeah.
So at the organization I work for, WCAPS, we actually have just partnered with the Atomic Board of Scientists to develop a board leadership program. I think another thing that cannot be overlooked is the access to information about the fact that these things exist and how to get onto a board to participate and to have your voice in those spaces. And so that is a program that we're funding, but that we are promoting and that we're taking part of, because a part of our mission is getting people those resources, getting people those access to be in the room where it happens. And so I think it's to the point that we've been making all day, shifting from policy to practice, or from paper to practice, and a lot of it is going to come from us. I am not jaded, but I'm definitely sick and tired of being sick and tired, and I'm sick and tired of waiting for white folk to do stuff for me. So I'm very happy to work at an organization where we've said, okay, we see this gap, let's fill it. We see that we have a need for information and resources to get out to this specific population. Let's create programming that's going to target them so that they can get into these spaces. And you're right, it does have everything to do with feminist foreign policy, because if you're not sitting on a board or sitting on the right boards, you're not going to get into the State Department. You're not going to get into a higher position at so-and-so organization to even have a say and influence in those rooms where it happens, because we are still very much based on who you know, where you're from, and how much money you have in your pocket.
I'm going to briefly just jump in here as somebody who fundraises for my newsletter. One thing that I think we can do as women is we can actually not only be aware of women-led organizations that we can fund, but we should also prep and train women to go out there and teach them how to fundraise. I'm up here, I'm obviously a professor, I'm not afraid to get up in front of people, but I have to tell you, I'm always scared to ask for money. And women of color, I think this is one of the things, I mean, because the reality is I think automatically someone's gonna just slam the door in my face. And I would love to be in a forum where people can kind of instill that confidence in me. I am a confident person, but it's one of those things where it's just like, no, I don't think anybody's gonna fund the thing, fund my newsletter and fund the thing that I want. So I think, we're here in the Women's Funding Network. I think the other thing that we need to do is we really need to invest in training young women of color to go out there and learn how to go out there and ask for money. Other questions?
Sounds like
Yes. Oh.
Okay, Christelle from Colmena Consulting. My question is, so you all discussed the question of who gets to imagine and come up and envision what solutions we have for the problems that we're facing currently, and even at a grassroots level within the international platform. What I'm curious though about is how do we engage with productive dissent and debate within these spaces, and how can we funders support or create the spaces for dissent and debate that allow for people who perhaps have not been engaged in this imagining process? How can that look like?
Does anybody want to take that?
I think a part of it is how do we have difficult conversations. There are a multitude of institutions that exist, Visions, Interfaith Philadelphia, several other organizations that exist to help people learn how to have those conversations. Tools for trauma-informed counseling, tools for trauma-informed leading, and other things like that that will allow you to go into these spaces with either the grace to have these conversations and the patience to work through people's trauma and their feelings, rightfully so, about the topics that might be raised. And then the other thing is, honestly, Google. If you can't afford to pay for a class, YouTube University is the freest, most available, best resource that you will ever source in life. And it also has folks who go on, create videos on how to have difficult conversations so that we can start calling people in instead of calling people out. And I think that is a really big part of why it's so tough to have these conversations. Because when I'm talking about racism to a white person, they feel like I'm talking to them and that they're the racist. Instead of me saying, no, racism is a system. You just happen to be white and I'm talking to you about it. And I think that is an important distinction. And so going on YouTube, I'm not sure where you're from, but there's probably a small grassroots organization that does training for how to have difficult conversations. Or a university mediation classes are also really great at helping you figure out how to have those tough conversations and just call people into the space and have them leaving with the need for a therapist because they've been unearthed some things within themselves that they got to work on.
Bridget?
Yeah, I think one thing is also philanthropy adopting an ecosystems approach to funding and what it looks like. And so on a project such as Feminist Foreign Policy, making sure that there's a multitude of organizations, groups that they're working with that are representing different regions, different perspectives on what this project looks like, how it's informed, and also making sure that the collectiveness and the collaborative opportunities for those groups to meet together, to be in struggle together, to have that commitment towards solidarity and conversations, and also consistently questioning who has not been in the room. There's been, for many folks, the conversations around feminist foreign policy, what it could look like in the US, what it looks like globally, has been happening for several years. And for some folks, this is the first time they're having this conversation. And so I think philanthropy also needs to work with partners who are on whatever topic it is. That's how we approach, for example, work on climate justice, is making sure consistently thinking about what the ecosystem of movements look like and where cross-collaboration amongst those movements and different regions has or hasn't happened, and trying to get philanthropy to fund equally not just the projects, but the collaboration and the process and the project of inclusion, the project of inviting in those who have not been part of that or centered in the conversation. Yeah.
Great. Well, we are out of time. And I definitely, I have to say, I'm so honored to be in this collaborative with all of you. Clearly, brilliant women, much smarter than I am. I hope that you'll join us tomorrow morning for Lyric's Talk, where she'll talk a little bit more about the collaborative and feminist foreign policy.